The blood of Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper stained Tyburn Hill, but their ends were grimly different. While one was granted the mercy of the axe, the other suffered the full barbaric horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. They didn't die for treason or rebellion, but for the most foolish crime in history, daring to touch King Henry VIII's woman. It was the bloody conclusion to a scandalous affair that shook the entire English court to its core. History in its haste often reduces them to a simple footnote in the tragic life of Queen Catherine Howard. But in reality, Dereham and Culpeper were real men who paid the ultimate price for their delusional recklessness. Their story is not just a death sentence. It is a bitter cautionary tale about the price of playing with fire right under the nose of a brutal king. England in 1541 was a land haunted by its own recent past. The countryside was littered with the skeletons of looted abbeys, silent reminders of a religious upheaval that had left the people spiritually torn and terrified. It was a kingdom destabilized by the execution of Thomas Cromwell, whose death left a dangerous political void now filled by vicious factional fighting. At the head of the realm sat Henry VIII, no longer a golden prince, but a 50-year-old tyrant consumed by the agony of a festering, ulcerated leg. Desperate to prove his virility and escape the stench of his own decay, the king became moody, paranoid, and easily manipulated by the conservative nobles who sought to control him. Catherine Howard was the instrument of that manipulation, a teenage pawn deployed by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, to secure power for their family. Henry seized upon her youth as a cure for his own mortality, willfully ignoring her lack of sophistication to worship a fantasy he called his rose without a thorn. In his delusion, he saw a pure virgin who could restore his youth, showering her with jewels, while blinding himself to the reality of the girl beneath the crown. Yet the court was a claustrophobic web of surveillance where privacy was impossible, and enemies were constantly watching. Oblivious to the danger, Catherine recklessly hired former lovers into her household, hiding deadly secrets in a place where silence was a commodity no one could afford. Among the thousands of people at court, two men were leading her straight to disaster. One was a living witness to the reckless mistakes of her youth. The other was a deadly temptation in her present life. To understand who Francis Dereham was, we must leave the luxury of the royal palace behind. We need to go back to the late 1530s, to the Duchess Agnes Howard's estate. It was a massive place, but completely chaotic and lacking in discipline. Dereham was not a high aristocrat. He was gentry, the son of John and Isabel Dereham of Norfolk. He was a man who had to scrape for his position. By the time he crossed paths with the young Catherine Howard, he was likely in his mid-20s, a grown man with worldly experience. Catherine, by contrast, was a child of perhaps 13 or 14. The Dowager Duchess household was meant to be a finishing school for young aristocratic ladies, a place where they learned manners, needlework, and piety. In reality, it was a dormitory of neglect. The Duchess was often at court or asleep, and the keys to the sleeping quarters were easily stolen. In this lax environment, Francis Dereham was the predator who became a lover. He did not court Catherine with poetry from a distance. He infiltrated her world. The testimony that would later emerge paints a picture of shocking domesticity. This was not a quick fumble in a darkened corridor. This was a relationship that mimicked marriage. Dereham and Catherine called each other husband and wife. In the eyes of their peers in the servants' hall, they were a couple. Dereham was bold. He would sneak into the girls' dormitory after the Duchess had retired. He brought gifts that a teenage girl would covet: sweet wine, strawberries, apples, and silks. He held court in her bed. The other girls in the dormitory, rather than reporting them, became complicit. They would watch or they would turn away, accepting the bribes of food and wine Dereham brought. The relationship went far beyond flirtation. They engaged in what the tutors euphemistically called naked bed. They would lie together under the covers, their bodies touching skin to skin. Years later, when the axe was hovering over her neck, Catherine would try to minimize this. But her own words, and the words of witnesses, were damning. She admitted that Dereham knew her carnally. She admitted he used her as a man does his wife. In the 21st century, we might view this as statutory rape given her age. But in the 16th century, the legal implications were different and far more dangerous for the future. Under the canon law of the time, if a man and woman declared themselves husband and wife and then consummated that promise with sexual intercourse, they were legally married in the eyes of God. No priest was required, no church ceremony was needed. Francis Dereham believed Catherine was his wife, and he had the receipts to prove it. Their marriage ended in a storm of jealousy. A music teacher named Henry Mannix, who also had designs on Catherine, wrote an anonymous letter to the Dowager Duchess exposing the affair. The Duchess, finally waking up to the chaos under her roof, was furious. She struck Catherine physically and drove Dereham out of the house. Dereham fled to Ireland. The historical records during this period of his life are patchy, but they are colorful. There are strong suggestions that he engaged in piracy, or at least aggressive privateering, to make his fortune. He was a man of action, a man who took what he wanted. But before he left, he did something that proved this was not just a fling for him. He gave Catherine £100. In the 1530s, this was a staggering sum of money, his entire life savings. He told her to keep it safe. It was the act of a husband providing for his wife while he went to war. He fully intended to return. He fully intended to claim her. He could not have known that when he returned, his wife would belong to the King of England. While Dereham was scraping a living in Ireland, Thomas Culpeper was rising through the stratosphere of the English court. If Dereham was the rough outsider, Culpeper was the ultimate insider. Born in Bedgebury, Kent, he came from a family that was fiercely loyal to the Tudors. But Thomas was special. He had a charisma, a physical beauty, and a charm that captivated Henry VIII. By 1541, Culpeper held the position of Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. To the modern ear, this sounds like a fancy butler. In reality, it was one of the most powerful political positions in the kingdom. Access was power. The king was the sun around which the world revolved, and Culpeper stood directly in the light. He slept in the king's bedroom. He was there when the king woke up. He was there when the king went to sleep. Most intimately and most strangely to our modern sensibilities, Culpeper was involved in the management of the king's body. When the physicians came to dress the ulcerated leg, Culpeper was often the one assisting. He saw the king not as a god, but as a weeping, bleeding, vulnerable old man. Henry treated him like a surrogate son, perhaps seeing in Culpeper the youth and vigor he had lost. But beneath the velvet doublet and the courtly manners, Thomas Culpeper was a dangerous man. The records from the time hint at a darkness that the king chose to ignore. There is a surviving legal record of a pardon granted to a Thomas Culpeper for a horrific crime: the rape of a park keeper's wife and the murder of a villager who tried to stop the assault. While some historians debate whether this was our Thomas Culpeper or his older brother, the weight of evidence suggests the favorite was capable of extreme violence. He was arrogant. He was entitled. He had learned the most dangerous lesson a young man can learn, that the law did not apply to him. He could rape, he could kill, and the king's love would wash him clean. He walked the corridors of Hampton Court with the swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was the king's favorite, but he wanted more. He had his eye on the king's prize. By the spring of 1541, the stage was set for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. On the throne sat Henry, blindly in love, physically rotting, desperate to believe in the illusion of his perfect marriage. In the shadows lurked Francis Dereham, returning from Ireland to find his wife wearing a crown. A smarter man would have run to the ends of the earth. Dereham, driven by arrogance, greed, or perhaps a twisted sense of ownership, walked right into the lion's den. He showed up at court, blackmailing Catherine with his mere presence. Terrified he would speak, she gave him a job. She made him her private secretary. She brought the smoking gun into her own household. And watching it all was Thomas Culpeper. He saw a queen who was bored. He saw a king who was repulsive. He saw a challenge. As the spring of 1541 turned into summer, the claustrophobic atmosphere of the royal palaces reached a breaking point. The king's excitement for his upcoming journey to the north was palpable. A grand tour designed to display his dominance and his beautiful young wife to his subjects. But while Henry prepared for a triumph, the shadows in Catherine's life were lengthening. The ghosts she thought she had left behind in the Duchess's dormitory were not content to stay in the past. They were packing their bags to join the royal caravan. As the massive machinery of the court began to move, it wasn't just luggage being loaded onto the wagons. It was a conspiracy that was about to find its most dangerous stage yet. In the summer of 1541, the Tudor court was preparing to move. King Henry VIII had ordered a great progress to the north of England. It was a massive logistical undertaking, a traveling city of thousands of courtiers, soldiers, servants, and tents moving through the English countryside. The goal was political, to subdue the rebellious north and show off the king's power. But for Queen Catherine Howard, the preparation for this journey was not a time of excitement. It was a time of suffocating terror. Francis Dereham had returned. When Dereham arrived at Hampton Court, he did not come as a beggar asking for charity. He came with the swagger of a man who held the keys to the kingdom. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that Catherine was now the wife of a king who had beheaded Anne Boleyn for suspected adultery. He knew that if the secret of their marriage in the Dowager Duchess's dormitory came out, Catherine was dead. He used this knowledge not just to get money, but to infiltrate her inner circle. He demanded a position in her household. Catherine, panicked and desperate to silence him, made the worst possible tactical decision. She hired him. She appointed Francis Dereham as her private secretary and gentleman usher. This was madness. By bringing him into her household, she was forced to see him every day. She gave him a salary, clothes, and access. But Dereham wasn't satisfied with just a job. He behaved with shocking insolence. Witnesses later testified that he treated the queen not with the reverence due to a monarch, but with the familiarity of a scorned ex-boyfriend. He would sit at the queen's council table when he wasn't invited. He would smirk at her across the room. He began to brag to the other servants. In the cramped, gossip-filled quarters of the royal palaces, Dereham dropped hints like grenades. He told anyone who would listen that he had known the queen before. He wore clothes that were too expensive for a secretary, purchased with the queen's money. But his arrogance reached a peak that crossed the line into high treason. One day, while boasting about his closeness to Catherine, he was asked what would happen if the king were to pass away. Dereham replied, coldly and clearly, "If the king were dead, I might marry her." In 1541, imagining the king's death was a capital crime. It was treason. Dereham was so blinded by his past ownership of Catherine that he forgot he was playing a game against a man who could snuff out his life with a wave of a hand. He was digging his grave, shovelful by shovelful, and he was dragging Catherine down with him. While Dereham was the threat from the past, the threat from the present was heating up. Thomas Culpeper was part of the king's inner circle for the Northern Progress. This meant he would be traveling with the court, staying in the same castles, hunting in the same forests. But a queen cannot simply meet a man. She is watched 24 hours a day. Her ladies-in-waiting sleep in her room. Guards stand at her door. For Catherine and Culpeper to meet, they needed a lockpick. They needed a third party willing to risk their own head to open the door. Enter Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Lady Rochford is one of history's great enigmas. She was a survivor. She had been married to George Boleyn, the brother of Queen Anne Boleyn. In 1536, her testimony, claiming that her husband and Anne had an incestuous relationship, helped send them both to the block. She had seen firsthand what Henry VIII did to adulterous wives and their accomplices. She had walked through the blood of her own family. And yet in 1541, she became the architect of Catherine Howard's destruction. Why? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was she vicariously living through the young queen's romance? Was she a voyeur? Or was she simply manipulated by a queen she couldn't say no to? The most likely answer is a mix of all three. Lady Rochford was the lady of the bedchamber. It was her job to manage the queen's private life. She became the go-between. She carried the messages. She signaled when the coast was clear. She bullied the other young ladies in waiting to go to sleep or leave the room. She stood guard at the back stairs while the King of England slept just down the hall. Without Lady Rochford, the affair would have remained a flirtation. With her, it became a conspiracy. The Royal Progress left London in June 1541. It was a miserable summer. It rained constantly. The roads turned to slurry. The mood in the massive caravan was tense. But inside the royal castles along the route, at Lincoln, at Pontefract, at York, the tension was of a different kind. The affair between Catherine and Culpeper shifted from glances to action. The logistics of these meetings were terrifyingly risky. At Lincoln, Lady Rochford organized a clandestine meeting in the Queen's private chambers. It was late at night. The king had retired to his own apartments. Culpeper, using his knowledge of the palace layout, slipped up the back stairs. Rochford stood watch. Catherine and Culpeper were alone. We do not know exactly what happened in those rooms. Under later interrogation, Culpeper admitted that he intended to sleep with her, but claimed the act was never consummated. Catherine said the same. They claimed they talked, they touched, they held hands. Culpeper later confessed that he wanted to know if she loved him, and she replied that she did. But in the eyes of the law, the biological details didn't matter. For a queen to meet a man alone at night, to declare love, to touch him, that was treason. It was a betrayal of the royal body. These meetings continued as the court moved north. At Pontefract Castle, the danger spiked. The castle was crowded. Culpeper had to hide in tight spaces, sneaking out at 2 or 3 in the morning. It is here that we see the true dynamic of the relationship. It wasn't just a romance, it was a power struggle. Culpeper was demanding. He was jealous. He was angry that Catherine was the king's wife. He wanted reassurance. Catherine, in turn, was terrified of losing him. She was a girl overwhelmed by the rotting husband in her bed, grasping at the beautiful youth who offered an escape. It was during this time that Catherine made her fatal error. She put it in writing. In a world before text messages, lovers wrote notes. Most were burned, but one survived. It was found later in Culpeper's belongings. He had foolishly, arrogantly kept it as a trophy. The letter is a window into Catherine's soul. It is not written in the formal guarded style of a queen. It is the rambling, desperate scrawl of a teenager in love. She wrote, "Master Culpeper, I heartily recommend me unto you, praying you to send me word how that you do." She worries about his health. She talks about the difficulty of sending messages. But then the raw emotion breaks through. "I never long so much for a thing as I do to see you and speak with you, the which I trust shall be shortly now. It makes my heart die to think I cannot be always in your company." And then the lines that would serve as her death warrant. "Come when my Lady Rochford is here, for then I shall be best at leisure to be at your commandment. Yours as long as life endures, Catherine. At your commandment." This was a queen submitting to a subject. Yours as long as life endures. This was a vow that superseded her marriage vows to the king. Culpeper kept the letter, perhaps to gloat, perhaps as leverage, or perhaps because he genuinely loved her. But that piece of paper was a ticking bomb sitting in his chest. While his wife was meeting Culpeper in the dark, and his new secretary Dereham was leering at her in the daylight, Henry VIII was having the time of his life. The North had submitted. The weather was clearing. His health seemed to stabilize momentarily. He felt like a king again, and he attributed this resurgence to Catherine. He believed the lie completely. In late October, as the court returned to Hampton Court, Henry ordered a special mass. He knelt in the chapel and publicly thanked God for the good life he led and trusted to lead with his beloved wife. He ordered the Bishop of Lincoln to draft a public prayer of thanksgiving for the Queen. The irony is almost unbearable to look back on. At the exact moment Henry was thanking God for her virtue, Catherine was likely panicking about how to keep Dereham quiet and when she could next see Culpeper. The court was a pressure cooker. The servants knew, the ladies-in-waiting knew. Dereham was boasting. Culpeper was strutting. Lady Rochford was spiraling. It was impossible to keep a secret this big in a world this small. The explosion didn't come from the king catching them in bed. It didn't come from a guard finding Culpeper on the stairs. It came from the most mundane place imaginable, a conversation between a brother and a sister. In late October 1541, the court was back in the South. A man named John Lascelles, a staunch Protestant reformer, went to visit his sister Mary Hall. Mary had been a servant in the Dowager Duchess's household years ago. She had lived in the dormitory with Catherine. John Lascelles, perhaps fishing for gossip or perhaps genuinely concerned, suggested that Mary should try to get a job in the Queen's household. It was a golden ticket for a servant. Mary Hall laughed. She shook her head. She told her brother she wouldn't dream of it. She said the Queen was light. Lascelles pressed her. And then Mary Hall spilled the secrets of the past. She told him about Francis Dereham. She told him about the naked bed. She told him about the husband and wife titles. She told him that Catherine Howard was not a virgin when she married the king. Lascelles was horrified, but he was also a political animal. He knew that if the king found this out on his own, and it was discovered that Lascelles knew and said nothing, he would be guilty of misprision of treason. He also likely saw a chance to strike a blow against the conservative Catholic faction at court, led by Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Lascelles didn't go to the king. He went to the one man who had the moral authority and the political safety to handle this nuclear material, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was a careful man. When he heard Lascelles' story, he knew he was holding dynamite. If the story was true, the Queen was a traitor. If the story was false and he accused the Queen, the king would have Cranmer's head for slander. The king loved Catherine. He was in a good mood. He was planning feasts. To walk into his chamber and tell him his rose without a thorn was damaged goods was suicidal. So Cranmer chose a passive-aggressive, bureaucratic method of destruction. He wrote the allegations down. He detailed the story of Francis Dereham and the pre-contract. He sealed the letter. On All Souls' Day, November 2nd, 1541, Henry attended Mass. As he knelt to pray, Cranmer quietly stepped forward and placed the letter on the king's pew, whispering that he should read it alone. Henry finished his prayers. He opened the letter. He didn't scream. He didn't order arrests immediately. His reaction was heartbreakingly human. He refused to believe it. He told his advisers it was a forgery, a malicious lie invented by someone who hated the Howards. He was so confident in Catherine's innocence that he ordered an investigation not to prove her guilt, but to prove the liars wrong so he could execute them. He ordered a secret inquiry. He wanted it done quietly to spare the Queen embarrassment. He had no idea he had just pulled the thread that would unravel his entire world. The devastating contents of Cranmer's letter sat heavy in the king's hands, a silent grenade that had yet to detonate. For a few agonizing hours, the court continued its rhythm, unaware that the world had fundamentally shifted. The music played, the servants scurried, and the Queen likely slept, dreaming of a future that had already been canceled. But the king's denial could only hold back the tide for so long. The moment the shock wore off, the machinery of the Tudor police state kicked into gear, transforming the palace from a home into a hunting ground where the prey had nowhere left to run. The morning of November 3rd, 1541, broke with an ominous silence at Hampton Court Palace. To the outer world, the servants scrubbing the floors, the cooks turning the spits, everything appeared normal. But in the king's private apartments, the air was thick with the smell of ruin. Henry VIII had read Cranmer's letter. He had ordered the investigation, but his reaction was not yet one of vengeance. It was one of flight. He could not bear to look at Catherine. The cognitive dissonance, the war between the rose without a thorn he worshipped and the damaged goods described in the letter, was too painful. Without saying a word to the Queen, Henry ordered his horses. He announced a sudden desire to go hunting in the countryside. He left Hampton Court, leaving Catherine behind. She would never see his face again. Catherine was confused. The king's sudden departure was odd, but she was used to his moods. She did not know that the doors of the palace were being quietly locked. She did not know that the guards at the gate had new orders. No one leaves. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the cat was already inside. The investigation moved with terrifying speed. The king's agents didn't start with the Queen. They started with the loose ends. They tracked down Francis Dereham. Dereham was still at court, strutting in his fine clothes, believing himself secure in his blackmail. When the guards came for him, the shock must have been absolute. He was dragged not to a gentleman's cell, but to the Tower of London. The interrogation of Francis Dereham is a pivotal moment in English legal history. At first, he was defiant. He likely assumed this was about money or minor misconduct. But the interrogators, led by the ruthlessly efficient Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley and the Duke of Norfolk, weren't asking about money. They were asking about the naked bed. Under the pressure of the rack, or the mere threat of it, Dereham broke. He admitted everything about the past. Yes, he had known the Queen carnally. Yes, they had called each other husband and wife. Yes, he had given her money. This confession was disastrous for Catherine's reputation, but legally it was complex. If Dereham and Catherine were pre-contracted, then Catherine's marriage to Henry was invalid. It meant she wasn't really the Queen. If she wasn't the Queen, she couldn't commit adultery against the king. She would be disgraced, annulled, and sent to a nunnery, but she would keep her head. But Dereham, sweating in the candlelight of the dungeon, realized he was the scapegoat. He was going to die for spoiling the king's goods. In a moment of desperate self-preservation, or perhaps spiteful vengeance against the woman who had moved on to a better lover, he dropped the second bombshell. He looked at his interrogators and essentially said, "Why are you asking me about what happened 3 years ago? You should be asking Thomas Culpeper about what happened last month." Dereham told them everything he had seen. He told them about the looks across the room. He told them about the secret meetings. He told them that while he had respected the Queen's new status, Culpeper had succeeded him in her affections. The investigation instantly mutated. It was no longer about a past indiscretion. It was now a hunt for present-day high treason. Back at Hampton Court, the silence was broken. Archbishop Cranmer arrived with a detachment of guards. He did not come to arrest Catherine. He came to question her. When he entered her chambers, he found a scene of total collapse. Catherine had heard the rumors. She knew Dereham had been arrested. When Cranmer walked in, she was in a state of frenzy, alternately weeping and screaming. She was so distinctive in her terror that Cranmer, a man who had overseen the destruction of Anne Boleyn, was genuinely moved to pity. He wrote to the king that he found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature. Cranmer had a plan. He was a political survivor, and he knew Henry still loved her. He came with a lifeline. His strategy was simple. If Catherine admitted to the pre-contract with Dereham, the marriage to Henry would be declared null and void from the start. She would be humiliated. Yes, she would be the woman who slept with a secretary, but she would not be a traitoress. You cannot betray a husband you were never legally married to. Cranmer sat with her. He spoke gently. He coaxed her. Just admit you were Dereham's wife, he effectively urged. Admit the pre-contract. But Catherine Howard, in her panic and immaturity, made the fatal mistake. She was terrified of admitting she was married to a low-born nobody like Dereham. She wanted to remain queen. She wanted to save her dignity. So she denied the pre-contract. She vehemently claimed she had never promised herself to Dereham. She claimed he had raped her. She claimed he used violence. She painted herself as a victim of his lust, but not his wife. By denying the pre-contract, she slammed the door on her only escape route. She remained legally the king's wife, and as the king's wife, any other relationship she had was treason. And then, in the midst of her blubbering denial, she too mentioned Thomas Culpeper. She admitted she had given him gifts. She admitted she had talked to him. She admitted she loved him. The trap snapped shut. Thomas Culpeper was likely asleep or attending to his duties when the world ended. He was the golden boy. He was untouchable. But when the name Culpeper came from the lips of both Dereham and the Queen, the king's protection evaporated. The rage of Henry VIII was slow to kindle, but once lit, it was an inferno. The betrayal by Catherine broke his heart. The betrayal by Culpeper broke his pride. This was the boy he had treated like a son. This was the man who touched his wounds. Culpeper was arrested. His rooms were ransacked. It was during this search that the king's agents found the physical evidence that made a trial almost unnecessary. The fatal love letter she had written him at Pontefract. The specific words she used, placing herself at his commandment, were all the proof the king needed. It proved intent. Under the Treason Act of 1534, imagining the king's death or violating the queen was treason. But the law was broad. Even inciting the queen to adultery was enough. Culpeper was hauled to the Tower. The beautiful youth who had slept in the king's velvet bed was now thrown into the damp straw of a traitor's cell. The mood in London shifted from gossip to bloodlust. The king's council was in overdrive. They needed to know everything. They arrested Lady Rochford. The woman who had facilitated the meetings was dragged in for questioning. Unlike the young lovers, Rochford was older and more fragile. She cracked almost immediately. She didn't try to protect anyone. She poured out every detail to save her soul, if not her body. She confirmed the backstairs meetings at Lincoln and Pontefract. She confirmed that she had stood guard. She confirmed that Catherine and Culpeper were alone for hours. She described Catherine's obsession with Culpeper. With Rochford's testimony, the timeline was complete. The past. Dereham and Catherine were lovers married in the Duchess's household. The cover-up. Catherine hired Dereham to keep him quiet. The present. Catherine fell in love with Culpeper and used Rochford to facilitate the affair. Henry VIII, receiving these reports in his seclusion, was devastated. He reportedly called for a sword to kill her himself, then burst into tears. He was a man mourning the death of his own potency. The illusion of his youth was dead. On December 1st, 1541, the legal machinery began to grind the two men into dust. The trial was held at the Guildhall. It was a show trial, but the evidence was overwhelming. Francis Dereham was charged with presumptive treason. The logic was twisted but effective. By joining the Queen's service while concealing his previous sexual relationship with her, he had entered the royal household with ill intent. He had soiled the lady who became queen, and by hiding it, he had deceived the king. Thomas Culpeper was charged with inciting the queen to adultery. Both men pleaded not guilty initially, but the weight of the confessions, Dereham's admission of the past, Culpeper's ownership of the letter, was insurmountable. Culpeper changed his tactic. He admitted to the meetings. He admitted to the intent. He admitted he wanted to sleep with her. He essentially threw himself on the mercy of the king, hoping that his years of loyal service and the king's affection would save him from the worst. Dereham had no such hope. He was the villain of the piece. He was the one who had ruined the rose. The jury took little time. The verdict was a foregone conclusion: guilty. The sentence pronounced by the judge was the standard punishment for traitors, a sentence designed to be as terrifying as it was painful. You are to be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, and there you are to be hanged by the neck, and being alive cut down, and your privy members to be cut off, and your bowels to be taken out of your belly and there burned, you being alive. The date was set. December 10th, 1541. Tyburn. Imagine the night of December 9th in the Tower of London. In one cell sat Thomas Culpeper. He was likely praying, or perhaps writing frantic letters to the king that would never be read. He was 20-some years old. He had had the world at his feet. Now, he was facing a death of medieval brutality. In another cell sat Francis Dereham. He had played the pirate, the lover, the blackmailer. He had gambled everything on the idea that he could control a teenage queen. He had lost. And in her apartments at Sion House, Catherine Howard sat in a stupor. She was no longer queen in anything but name. She was a girl waiting to die. She reportedly practiced laying her head on the block, trying to understand the mechanics of her own end. But even at the end, the class system of England exerted its power. On the morning of the execution, a message arrived from the king. It was an act of mercy, but a selective one. King Henry VIII had commuted the sentence of Thomas Culpeper. Because of his noble birth and because he had been the king's favorite, he would not be disemboweled. He would not be hanged. He would simply be beheaded. It was a clean death. For Francis Dereham, the secretary, the nobody, the man who had her first, there would be no mercy. The full sentence would stand. The stage was set for the final act at Tyburn. The crowd was gathering. The hurdles, wooden sleds drawn by horses, were waiting at the tower gates. The two men were brought out into the winter light. With the guilty verdicts read and the sentences pronounced, the legal formalities were over. The quill and ink of the courtroom were now swapped for the rope and axe of the executioner. For Culpeper and Dereham, the abstract terror of a traitor's death was about to become a visceral physical reality. As the sun rose on that freezing December morning, the focus shifted from the secret whispers of the royal chambers to the public spectacle of Tyburn, where the king intended to write his message of vengeance in blood for all of London to see. On the morning of December 10th, 1541, the gates of the Tower of London groaned open. A cold mist clung to the Thames, but the streets were already packed. A public execution in Tudor London was not just justice, it was theater. It was a carnival of morality, and the citizens of London had turned out in their thousands to see the king's vengeance enacted. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham did not walk to their deaths. They were drawn. This part of the sentence is often overlooked in history books, but it was a crucial part of the torture. The men were strapped onto hurdles, crude flat wooden sleds or wicker panels that were tied to the tails of horses. They were dragged through the filth of the London streets. The journey from the Tower to Tyburn was roughly 3 miles. It was a slow, agonizing procession. Lying on their backs, the men would have stared up at the gray sky, feeling every cobble, every rut, and every splash of freezing mud. The crowds lined the route, jeering, spitting, and throwing refuse. For Culpeper, the golden boy, who was used to riding fine stallions and walking on rushes, this was a humiliation as sharp as any knife. For Dereham, it was the final confirmation that his gamble had failed. He was being dragged through the dirt of the city he had tried to conquer. When the procession finally reached the Tyburn tree, the infamous triangular gallows, the distinction between the two men became starkly visible. Thomas Culpeper was unstrapped from his hurdle first. He stood up, his clothes likely ruined from the journey, but his bearing that of a courtier. The crowd quieted. There was a strange respect for a man who dies well, and Culpeper was determined to die like a gentleman. He was granted the king's mercy. There was no rope for him, no knife, just a block. He climbed the scaffold. It is customary for the condemned to give a speech, and while records vary, the essence of Culpeper's final words was an admission of legal guilt, but a denial of the ultimate act. He asked the crowd to pray for him. He did not rail against the king. To do so would have meant the confiscation of his family's property. Even in death, he had to play the game. He knelt. He placed his neck on the block. The executioner raised the axe. With a single heavy blow, the head of Thomas Culpeper was severed. It was over in seconds. The crowd let out a breath. It was a clean death. The king had spared his favorite the pain, if not the punishment. Francis Dereham watched this. He was forced to stand and witness the swift, relatively painless end of his rival. He must have prayed for the same mercy. It did not come. When Culpeper's body was dragged away, the executioner turned to Dereham. For him, the script was different. He was not a favorite. He was the spoiler. He was the man who had touched the queen first. Henry VIII wanted him to suffer not just death, but deconstruction. Dereham was made to climb the ladder under the beam of the gallows. The rope was placed around his neck. But this was not a drop hanging designed to break the neck instantly. This was a strangulation. The cart was driven away, and Dereham was left swinging, kicking at the empty air. The crowd watched as his face turned purple, his eyes bulging. He fought for breath, the panic of asphyxiation taking hold. But just as he was on the brink of unconsciousness, the executioner cut the rope. Dereham fell to the ground, gasping, choking, but very much alive. This was the cruelty of the sentence. The law required him to be alive and sensible for what came next. While he lay on the straw, likely vomiting and struggling to breathe, the executioner seized him. The next steps were highly symbolic. First, he was castrated. The privy members were cut off and thrown into a fire that had been stoked nearby. It was a brutal message. This is the manhood that offended the king. Then came the knife to the belly. Dereham, fully conscious and likely screaming, was sliced open. The executioner reached into the cavity of his body and pulled out his bowels. The smell of blood, burning flesh, and excrement filled the air. His entrails were burned before his still living eyes. Finally, the executioner cut out his heart. Only then did Francis Dereham die. But the ritual wasn't finished. His corpse was beheaded. His body was then hacked into 4 quarters. These pieces were not buried. They were to be boiled in cumin and tar to preserve them, then sent to different corners of the kingdom as a warning. Later that afternoon, the final act of the day took place on London Bridge. The heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were dipped in tar to protect them from the birds and the weather. They were impaled on tall iron spikes above the stone gatehouse. They were positioned side by side. In life they had been rivals, one the rough pirate, the other the smooth courtier. In death they were identical grinning skulls looking down on the city that had chewed them up. It is a chilling historical detail that Catherine Howard, who was still imprisoned at Sion House, would eventually have to travel under that bridge. When she was finally brought to the Tower of London to meet her own fate, her barge would pass beneath the rot of the men she had loved. While the blood was drying at Tyburn, Catherine Howard was in a state of shock. The news of the executions reached her quickly. The reality of her situation was no longer a frightening possibility. It was a certainty. Henry VIII was not done. He had killed the lovers, but he still had to deal with the wife. However, a legal problem remained. Catherine had not admitted to the pre-contract. Therefore, legally, she was still the queen. Henry could not simply execute a queen for adultery without a trial, and a public trial would air even more of the king's dirty laundry. He had been humiliated enough. So the king and his council devised a new weapon. They would not give her a trial. They would not let her speak in her own defense. They would use Parliament to kill her. They drafted a Bill of Attainder. This was a legislative act that simply declared a person guilty of treason without the need for a judicial process. It was a death sentence by vote. But before the vote could pass, they needed to strip her of everything. In the weeks following the executions of Culpeper and Dereham, Catherine was systematically dismantled. Her jewels were taken. Her velvet gowns were replaced with simple gray wool. The title of queen was forbidden. She was referred to only as Mistress Catherine Howard. The rose without a thorn had been plucked, crushed, and discarded. In another cell in the tower, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was unraveling. The strain of the interrogation and the guilt of her role had broken her mind. She began to hallucinate. She spoke in riddles. She was, by all accounts, insane. This presented a problem for Henry. English law forbade the execution of the insane. It was considered a sin to kill someone who could not make their peace with God. But Henry VIII was past the point of religious niceties. He was a man possessed by a need for total erasure of this stain on his honor. In a twist of dark irony, he sent his own royal physicians to the Tower, not to heal Lady Rochford so she could live, but to heal her just enough so she could be legally executed. They treated her with tonics and rest, nursing her back to a state of sanity so that the axe could fall. Christmas 1541 was a grim affair at court. The king was trying to pretend everything was normal, hosting feasts and music. But the shadow of the bridge loomed over everything. The empty chairs where Culpeper used to sit, the absence of the giggling young queen. It was a haunted house. As January 1542 turned to February, the Bill of Attainder was passed. Catherine Howard was condemned to die. The girl who had loved to dance, who had been seduced by a pirate and courted by a favorite, was about to face the final curtain. And in those last days, a legend was born, a story of a fallen queen trying in her final moments to find a scrap of dignity. The gruesome theater at Tyburn had concluded, leaving the crowd satisfied and the king's honor brutally defended. But while the men's heads were already tarred and mounted, the central figure of the tragedy remained in a terrifying limbo. Catherine Howard sat in the silence of Sion House, a queen without a crown, waiting for a mercy that would never come. As the year turned from 1541 to 1542, the rage of the king did not cool, it calcified. He had dealt with the thieves. Now, with a cold and methodical precision, he turned his gaze toward the prize they had stolen. On February 10th, 1542, the waiting ended. The barge arrived at Sion House to take Catherine Howard to the Tower of London. This was not the royal barge that had carried her to her coronation, draped in gold cloth and blowing trumpets. It was a somber vessel, manned by silent guards. As she stepped onto the boat, Catherine was no longer the defiant girl who had denied her pre-contract. She was broken. She was barely 20 years old, stripped of her jewels, her crown, and her dignity. The journey down the Thames was a slow drift into the heart of darkness. The river was the lifeblood of London, but for Catherine it was a cemetery. As the barge cut through the grey water, it approached London Bridge. We cannot know for certain if she looked up, but it would have been impossible to ignore. The bridge was low and the spikes were high. There, swaying in the winter wind, were the tarred heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham, the man who had seduced her in the dormitory and the man who had courted her in the palace, both reduced to grim warnings, staring down at the woman who had connected them. The barge passed under the bridge and arrived at the Traitor's Gate. This was the water entrance to the Tower of London, a gaping maw of stone that had swallowed Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and countless others. Catherine was helped out of the boat shivering not just from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that she had reached the end of her life. The night before her execution, February 12th, is the source of one of history's most haunting stories. Catherine was housed in the royal apartments of the Tower, the same rooms where she had stayed before her coronation. The luxury must have felt like a cruel joke. She was composed, but her terror was practical. She had never seen an execution. She didn't know how to die. She was terrified that she would faint or struggle or make a mess of the final moment. She wanted to die like a queen, even if she had been stripped of the title. So she made a request that stunned the constable of the Tower. She asked him to bring the executioner's block to her room. He agreed. The heavy piece of wood, curved to fit a human neck, was hauled into her private chamber. Alone, or perhaps with her confessor watching, Catherine Howard knelt down. She placed her neck on the wood. She practiced positioning herself. She tested the hardness of the block against her throat. She rehearsed her own death over and over again, trying to memorize the movements so that when the morning came, her body would know what to do, even if her mind collapsed. It is a singular image of Tudor tragedy. A teenage girl in a stone room, rehearsing her murder on a block of wood, trying to be good one last time. The morning of February 13th, 1542, was dark and cold. The execution was to be private, held within the walls of the Tower on Tower Green, rather than before the mob on Tower Hill. This was a small mercy, reserved for those of royal blood. A crowd of courtiers had gathered to witness the event. Among them was the king's cousin, the Earl of Surrey. They stood in silence as the former queen was led out. Catherine was weak. She had to be helped up the scaffold steps. She was dressed in dark velvet, a stark contrast to the bright silks she had loved. When she reached the platform, She saw the block, the real one this time. Beside it stood the executioner, masked and holding the axe. The straw was spread to catch the blood. She turned to speak. The legends say she cried out, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper." It is a romantic, defiant line, but it is almost certainly a myth, invented by later Victorian writers. The contemporary records tell a sadder, more submissive story. Catherine admitted her faults against the king. She acknowledged that she deserved to die for offending him. She asked the people to pray for her soul and to pray for the king's long life. It was a standard scaffold speech, scripted by fear and convention. She was trying to protect her family from further wrath. But then the rehearsal paid off. She knelt. She refused the blindfold. She arranged her dress. She placed her head on the block, positioning it just as she had practiced in her room. She whispered her prayers. The axe rose. It fell. The rose without a thorn was gone. Her head was held up to the silent crowd, the blood dripping onto the frost-covered stones. The horror wasn't over. Lady Rochford was waiting her turn. Jane Boleyn had to step onto the scaffold that was still wet with her mistress's blood. She was a woman who had survived the fall of Anne Boleyn, who had navigated the treacherous waters of the court for decades. But her luck had finally run dry. She was composed, perhaps numbed by the treatment the doctors had given her, or perhaps simply ready to leave a world that had been so cruel. She gave a brief speech, asking for forgiveness. She knelt. The axe fell a second time. With Lady Rochford's death, the Boleyn faction, the family that had changed the religion of England and birthed Elizabeth I, was effectively crushed. She was the last loose end of a tragedy that had started years ago. The bodies of Catherine Howard and Lady Rochford were wrapped in cloths. They were not given a grand funeral. They were carried a few yards away to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, located within the tower walls. There, the flagstones were lifted. The bodies were dumped into the earth, close to the remains of Catherine's cousins, Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn. It was a family reunion of the headless. There was no marker, no monument, just a cold stone floor sealing them in darkness. The tragedy turned on a single legal pivot point, the pre-contract. Had Catherine simply admitted to Cranmer that she was Dereham's wife by pre-contract, her marriage to Henry would have been invalid. She would have been a disgraced bigamist, yes, but not a traitor. By denying Dereham, she sealed her fate as the adulterous wife of the king. And if Dereham's death was the result of a legal technicality, Culpeper's was a terrifying expansion of state power. He wasn't killed for sex, he was killed for imagination. The Treason Act punished the intent as severely as the deed. In the absolute monarchy of Henry VIII, imagining the king's replacement was the same as killing him. On the day Catherine died, Henry VIII did not wear black. He did not cancel court. He went about his business. But those close to him saw the change. The execution of Catherine Howard broke something in him that never healed. He had killed wives before, but Catherine was different. She was his hope. She was his youth. By killing her, he was forced to admit that he was an old, foolish man who had been duped by a child. He would marry once more to Catherine Parr, but the passion was gone. He became a man-eater, a tyrant whose rages were legendary. The ghost of the girl he had worshipped haunted him. He grew fatter, sicker, and more vicious. The tragedy of 1541 was not just about the deaths of 3 young people. It was the death of the king's soul. History is written in books, but memory is written in stone. And the stones of Hampton Court Palace remember. There is a corridor in the palace known as the Haunted Gallery. Legend tells us that in 1541, shortly after her arrest, but before she was taken to the Tower, Catherine Howard escaped her guards. She knew the king was in the chapel hearing Mass. She ran down the gallery screaming, desperate to reach the doors, to bang on them, to beg the king for one last chance to explain. She never made it. The guards caught her just before the door. They dragged her back, screaming and kicking, while the king sat in silence on the other side of the wood, ignoring the cries of the woman he had worshipped. To this day, visitors and staff at Hampton Court report a strange chill in that gallery. Some claim to hear a woman screaming. Others describe a feeling of overwhelming panic. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story persists because it captures the emotional truth of the tragedy, the desperate, terrified child running toward a deaf God. If you walk across London Bridge today, the spikes are gone. The modern city of glass and steel towers over the Thames. But if you listen closely to the wind off the river, you can almost hear the echo of 1541, the creak of the rope, the thud of the axe, and the silence of a king who learned too late that you can cut off a head, but you cannot kill the truth.